Israel decisively defeats three Arab armies in just 1 week in 1967 in a war known as the Six-Day War. But how did Israel, who was fighting on three fronts, achieve such a quick and decisive victory, and why Arab countries failed to react in music? Almost 20 years after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Middle East is still grappling with the political consequences of the establishment of the Jewish state of Palestine in the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and the Jordanian-controlled West Bank, still hoping that the coming war will destroy it. Israel and led to the creation of a Palestinian state in its place. While Syria supports Palestinian groups such as Fatah with the aim of attacking and destabilizing Israel, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who hopes that amid the wave pan-Arab nationalism becomes the leader of the Arab world, then it feels confident. The United States and the Soviet Union intervened on Egypt's behalf in the fiery crisis of 1956, while Israel emerged militarily stronger but remained geographically isolated and surrounded by belligerent nations. He launched a failed coup that led the socialist government in Damascus to purge the government and army and damaged Egypt-Syria relations. Israel is one of the issues that unites Arab countries, where most Arab leaders play to public opinion and take a strong political stance against Israel, and counterattacks by Syrian forces and Palestinian militias are common to Israeli civilians, especially in the highlands. They target the Golan, which leads to Israeli retaliation. Syria uses these retaliatory measures, humiliating Egypt for its inaction against Israel after one such attack by Palestinians on November 13, 1966, when Israeli forces stormed the village of Samonasu in the West Bank, does not want to provoke Israel and does nothing to further criticize Syria and Jordan. Egypt has abandoned it. The Arab situation escalated further on April 7, 1967, when Syria instigated a bombardment of Syrian artillery positions in Israeli border towns. Pressure will mount on Israel and Arab countries to respond to the threats on May 14th. The Soviet Union warns Nasser that Israel may soon attack Syria. The reason for this warning is not clear, but it is not the fact that Soviet, Syrian and Egyptian sources found out days later. But by then it is too late. President Nasser unwilling to be seen. Egyptian Field Marshal Abdel Hakim's weak order to send Egyptian units to the Sinai closer to Israel on May 19th, the United Nations Emergency Force, or UNF, which has since been deployed in. They were located on the border of Egypt and Israel. 1956 evacuated Sinai at Nasser's request. On the same day, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol doubles the number of mobilized reserves and sends 300 tanks to the southern border. On May 24, he announced the closure of the Strait of Traan to Israeli shipping, which had been forcibly opened by Israel in 1956. Egyptian forces marched in the streets of Cairo towards Sinai. Arab expectations of war are rising, and media outlets such as Radio Cairo are broadcasting fiery rhetoric as the Gulf of Aqaba is closed. It will be destroyed by the military and economic boycott of the Arabs, or it will be destroyed by the fire of the Arab forces that covers it from the south, north, and east. For Israel, the strait is a key economic shipping route, and the blockade is considered an act of war. Eshkol orders full military mobilization that brings Israel's economy to a halt. Women and children begin digging trenches and preparing mass graves in Tel Aviv as reserves are called up across the country on June 4th. As votes, Israel's war cabinet is getting taller. The preemptive strike is set for 7 a.m. on June 5, 1967, on the eve of war. The Israel Defense Forces, or Israel Army, has 264,000 soldiers, including reservists, and 1,000 tanks, mostly of modified World War II models, as well as well-trained crews. 250 warplanes capable of two sorties. Egypt has 100,000 troops, and 950 tanks in the Sinai along with 282 warplanes, while Syria has 75,000 troops and 300 tanks in the Golan Heights, and Jordan has 120 fighters with 1 trained aircraft English with 30 planes of military forces over the military field, modern tanks and 24 modern fighter jets. Israel's leadership is determined that this war will be different from the close conflict in 1948, and the preemptive strike plan has been in development for years. Many befriending senior Egyptian officers, while posing as ex-SS officers, these agents help Israel map the location of any Egyptian aircraft on the ground, often identifying their pilots, slow down, and even do the voice of Israeli pilots, practicing their flight plans, and they and the ground crew know their targets and plans. Even before the flight order arrives, the pilots take off at various times from various bases around Israel and maintain abject radio silence until 7:30 a.m. on June 5th, when approximately 200 Israeli jets head for their targets. They fly low over Egypt to avoid radar detection. Coincidentally, Egyptian anti-aircraft batteries do not have orders to fire, as Field Marshal Amir lands on an airbase that same morning. Israeli jets destroy almost all Egyptian air bases and kill communications cables between Sinai and Egyptian Army HQ. A third of the Egyptian pilots and the destruction of most of the Egyptian warplanes. Egyptian pilot Hashem Mustafa recalls the scene about 30 seconds after the end of the attack, of the latest and most equipped fighter jets with handguns. 100% casualty ratio for us, 0% for them. Israel loses only 9 out of 200 planes over Egypt. Israeli Air Force also attacks Syrian and Jordanian airfields, and it destroys more than half of Syria, and most of the Jordanian planes and gangs are bypassing the Israeli army's attacks on the ground, as well as on the coast, the armorers of Rafah and the Gaza Strip, in order to maximize the speed of the attack on the Sinai forces. Positions exposed to heavy armored attack on several axes, with the sea at our back to the north, and constant air and artillery bombardment. We had almost no communication with other headquarters in the sector, and no knowledge of what was happening on the battlefield in Israel's time. We didn't have tanks race for Canal in northern Sin. Another force led by Major General Sharon breaks through Egypt's defenses at Kf on the move towards Abu May. Israeli mechanized infantry and tanks with massive artillery support begin their attacks, while paratroopers landing by helicopter destroy Egyptian artillery positions. By evening, the Egyptian 7th and 20th Divisions are destroyed. At 400 p.m. became an emotional field marshal. Amir informs President Nasser that they both agreed to cover casualties to ensure that Syria and Jordan do not withdraw from the war. By the end of the first day, Israel effectively destroys Jordanian and Syrian Egyptian air forces in the Sinai. Deleted. Egyptian forces have lost their first line of defense and are retreating in the east. King Hussein destroys Israel's hopes for Jordanian neutrality when he launches border raids. They resist, but the rate of Israeli fire is too high. It is a set of barbed wire and fortifications. Israeli soldiers have fortified Mount Scopus, while Jordanian soldiers are garrisoned in the Ottoman walls around the old city at 2 a.m. on June 6th. The 2nd Al-Husseini Battalion over a very strong position known as Ammunition Hill. Jordanian forces destroy 2 Israeli tanks. A Jordanian officer shoots down an artilleryman in his position, and the battle ends in a fierce hand-to-hand battle. The Israelis capture the hill. At 5 a.m., however, 31 Israelis and 71 Jordanians were killed. Israeli paratroopers also raided the American colony in the south, but Jordanian soldiers ambushed them after taking a wrong turn. A few seconds turned into a slaughterhouse. Before the transformation was intense, I hid myself without fear. I felt abandoned and suddenly disappointed. Israeli tanks, bazooka teams, and paratroopers fighting in a nearby neighborhood overcame strong Jordanian resistance. Enjoyed complete air superiority. It crushed Jordanian reinforcements approaching from the east. I'll never forget the hallucinatory sight of that broken rose, blocked by all kinds of vehicles. to open a path under the monstrous cigarettes screamed by hordes of Israeli mirages in a cloudless blue sky, screaming with the sun until noon, the only old city left in the hands of Jordan to the north. Syria is attacking its lands, but it is a disaster. The Syrian tankers find that the bridges they have to cross are too narrow for their T-34s, and local Israeli militias break up the attack, the only Syrian attack of the war, while Israeli forces disorganize the Egyptian resistance in the Sinai. They gave and pushed towards the canal, an area in Gaza that is surrounded on three sides by Israel. Israeli units are defeating Palestinian militants in an urban battle at night. Marshal Amir and King Hussein, after another day of Israel's success, ordered to retreat to new positions. The old city of Jerusalem is within reach, and the Egyptian army is more vulnerable. More than ever, in the old city of Jerusalem on the night of June 7th, Jordanian soldiers could see columns of reinforcements being hit by the Israeli Air Force and running out of supplies as Israeli forces began to encircle them. The 55th Paratrooper Brigade sends a message to its battalion commanders. We are occupying the heights overlooking the old city. In a little while, we will enter the ancient city of Jerusalem, which we have dreamed of and strive for generations. We will be the first to enter it. Become the Jewish nation is waiting for our victory. Israel is waiting for this historic hour. Be proud, be successful. A few minutes later, the paratroopers are standing in the Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, and will soon reach the Western Wall for many Israelis and its supporters in the Jewish diaspora. The photos of this moment will become the defining images of the war for King Hussein. But it is a disaster. His army and air force are destroyed. Part of his kingdom is destroyed, and he has failed to protect Islam's third holiest site on the Egyptian front. Tank, trucks and soldiers crowd the roads as Israeli jets attack them with napalm bombs and cannons, while IDF ground forces move towards the MLA and Gidi passes by, including the effective use of T-55 tanks against Israeli AMX light tanks. But what starts as an orderly Egyptian retreat turns into a path where everyone loses their head. We are told to retreat, but we get to positions to find which was already in the flames of the army on the roads, the state of complete collapse of a disaster massacre. The following day, June 8th, the disaster continues in Sinai. The Israeli army captures so many Egyptian prisoners of war that it disarms them and frees them to cross the burning canal on foot. There are also reports of Israeli soldiers. Execution of Egyptian forces as Israeli forces retreat. Reach canal in northern Sinai. 80% of Egyptian military equipment, including 10,000 trucks, 700 tanks, and hundreds of guns, has been destroyed in the confusion of advancing Israeli planes and torpedoes on a U.S. Navy intelligence ship. USS Liberty capsizes off Egyptian coast, killing 34 U.S. crew. The incident prompts U.S. and Israeli investigations into reparations, calling it an accident, while Egyptian propaganda extols Egypt's victories in the Sinai. Chief President Nasser and Field Marshal Amir privately admit that the war on time has been lost. 7:43 p.m. Ansar announced that Egypt accepts the ceasefire and intends to resign. Spontaneous protests across Egypt pressure him not to resign, so he continues. But the war in Egypt is over, and Jordan and Egypt are out of the war. The Israeli army goes to the Syrian defense lines on the Golan. The heights are set on steep rocky terrain and overlook the Israeli positions. Minefields line the few roads in the highlands, and Syrian troops are dug in tanks and artillery trenches, offer some protection from Israeli airstrikes. But the Syrian units, recently poorly trained, lack a cohesive leadership. The clearance and lack of effective air cover and air defenses of Syrian tanks, even including the German Panzer IV tanks of the Second World War era, are now obsolete. The help of intelligence gathered from the Israeli spy Eli Cohen shot. Over 1,000 airstrikes against Syrian positions, but ineffective in destroying Syrian trenches. Syrian defenders inflict heavy casualties on Israeli tanks and bulldozers while slowly advancing to clear boulders and mines. When Israeli infantry finally, it takes hours to drive them to the Syrian trenches. Syrian defenders and 30 Israelis and 60 Syrians were killed when Israeli forces attacked again on June 10th. They found that the Syrian defenses had been abandoned as Syrian units retreated to Katra, but Syrian radio mistakenly announced that Katra was already lost, causing panic among Syrian army units. Retreating in confusion towards Damascus, even the commander of the Syrian front, Ahmed al-Mehr, flees on horseback in the chaos. An Israeli commander reports that we reached the gates of Katra. Almost without any obstacles, everything is working well. Kurdish tanks with their engines still working. Communication equipment still working. We arrested Ketra without war. On the afternoon of June 10th, Syria accepts a ceasefire with the undefended road to Damascus after 6 days of almost continuous fighting on 3 fronts. The surprising Arab air defenses were simply not ready for a full-scale war, and this allowed the Israeli Air Force to destroy the entire Egyptian Jordanian Air Force and most of the Syrian Air Force on the first day, giving Israel complete air superiority. Air Israel allowed to concentrate on one front at the same time. The armies of Egypt and Syria suffered from widespread corruption, and conscripts lacked food and ammunition. Many of them were barely trained. Assigned to the attack mainly because of his friendship with Nasser, he did not react to the attack and ordered a premature withdrawal. All in all, while the 6-day war was swift, it still had a terrible human toll, with Israel losing 679 soldiers killed and 15 Arab casualties. Estimated Egyptian losses of about 11,000 dead, with about 5,000 Jordanians, 6,000 dead and 500 captured. And Syria is more difficult with 1,000 dead with 60. Captured Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, who had hoped the war would lead to independence, instead found Israel for the first time, partly responsible for the hundreds of thousands of Arabs who did not live within its official borders in the West Bank, about 240,000. Palestinians fled to Jordan and other Arab countries as refugees in the Golan Heights, separated their Arab villages from family and friends on the Syrian-controlled side. In some Muslim countries, there is a wave of anti-Semitic violence against Jewish communities in Egypt, Yemen, Libya. Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq, and Tunisia saw arrested Jews beaten or synagogues burned, and many deported. Mastered in time and suddenly 3 times larger in terms of territory for many Israelis, the war was a miraculous retelling of the story of David and Goliath in the Arab world known as Nakba, or the Arab countries' withdrawal, who take revenge and they refuse to recognize or make formal peace with Israel. That puts the region at risk of another war for the Palestinians. The 6-day war led to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, a situation that is still unresolved almost 60 years later. The 6-day war was another step in the escalation. In the case of the Middle East conflict and another Cold War proxy battleground just before the 6-day war, Israel probably acquired its first nuclear weapon and considered nuclear power for civilian use, just like many countries that, at that time in the Soviet Union, they did with the prospect of nuclear energy. Communism had survived Stalin, and the first atomic grids or atomic cities were being designed near the Ukrainian village of Pert. Thank you for being with me until this video. I would love to write your comments in the comments of this video, and subscribe to our channel to see new videos. God bless you until the next video.